actually being live streamed to the whole world, I think. Welcome to this evening's Night of Crime. We have an expert in crime here in David Whish-Wilson. You'll have gathered that I'm not Colleen Egan. I could kind of say I'm Colleen Egan, but I had one of those operations between the time the program was printed and now, but I didn't bring my dress. Colleen couldn't make it, so I'm later on. David is the author of 3 crime novels now.
And he became disgraced and was labelled a rat because he spoke out at the Royal Commission in support of one of the main character who was murdered, Ruby Devine. It was very closely based on Shirley Finn. And there's a whole other story which we can maybe talk about later. But Frank Swan manages to survive the travails of Line of Sight, and he's also the main character of this book, Zero at the Bone. Unfortunately, he's no longer in the police force. He's lost his regular pay packet, he's lost his pension, and he's eking out a living as a very kind of low-rent private investigator. The little passage I'm going to read illustrates how far he's fallen from grace, because he's sitting in a swamp in Bibra Lake on a Saturday night, trying to catch the people who are stealing the front lawns of the new housing subdivision. So it's hardly the cloak and daggers and high drama that he's used to. But he's got a family to feed, and Frank is a family man, so he's doing it. He's trying to resist the urge to take a swig from his bottle of whiskey, and he's only just succeeding. Yeah, it's a new subdivision in Bibra Lake, and people are going to bed, their beautiful new homes. They're watering in their front lawn the night before, and they're waking up the following morning to find that the front lawn, someone has come and rolled up the turf and stolen it. And it's just not right. And so Frank has to catch the culprit. So this is Frank realising who it is. Swan saw them coming from his left, 3 men with wheelbarrows. They didn't muck around. Parked their barrows on the street and started rolling up the lawn, placing them in the wheelbarrows, then returning for more. Swan took up his binoculars and focused. Had to laugh. He thought he'd recognised the eldest from his slope-shouldered gait, the knotty legs and arms, scanned farmer, wearing the blue terry-tailing hat that he always wore, the same grotty white singlet and ball-tight studies, barefoot. It was Stan who had the contract to lay the lawn. Now he was taking it back, recycling. The 3 men looked pissed. All day laying the lawn, then all night pitching it back. Only the pub session in between. His 2 sons offsiders. Swan knew farmer from his childhood. He was one of his stepfather Brian's workmates. Took compo for an injury on the docks, then set up his own gardening business. Sell something, nick it back, sell it again. Oldest scam in the book. When Swan had asked about the company laying the grass, he'd been told by the developer not to worry. It was being done by a mate. Stan was everybody's mate. Swan put away his binoculars and relaxed into his seat, took the cap off the bottle of Grants and allowed himself a good smoke. They'd be at it for some time, and he wasn't tasked with arresting the culprit, just identifying him. What he had to decide was whether he would. Swan's stepfather had plenty of dodgy stevedore mates, but Stan was one of the best. An old lefty, but genuine about it. Part of that ethos meant stealing whatever wasn't nailed down from those who could afford it. Swan knew the rules. He'd grown up with them. Never nick anything from someone worse off than you. Stan Farmer had often brought food when Swan was a kid and Brian was on the drink, gone for days with his pay packet, coming home when it was spent. Stan would slip Swan's mother a few coins. The children of drunks and gamblers were often looked after by people like Stan, whose own father had been a drunk. Stan knew what it was like to be hungry. Stan had obviously decided that the developer was either a dickhead or could afford to be ripped off, or both. The trick for Swan was to make sure Stan didn't thieve the lawns again. Only then would Swan get paid. He thought about it for a while, the whiskey helping to pass the time. By 4 o'clock, Farmer and Sons had taken up each of the lawns on the new street and wheeled them around the corner. Swan waited for the ignition on Stan's old Bedford truck before starting up the Holden. He followed the Bedford with his headlights off. The truck was fully laden, a tarp thrown over the turf that was ready to be relayed come the dawn. Stan didn't live too far away on a quiet street in Coolbellup. Swan parked down from Stan's house, watched the 3 tired men enter the Fibro home, no lights coming on. He lit a cigarette and took up the CB handfest. It was a crime to impersonate a police officer, but Swan knew the codes. There was little chance of being caught. He put on his most youthful voice, pretending to be a uniformed constable from Kwinana Station and giving a false name. He told them about the speeding car he'd followed up the coast to a quiet Kubi street. Described how he'd peered through the kitchen window, seen a table laden with drugs and cash. Mounds of it, just sitting there. He was awaiting further orders. Swan cut himself off before he started laughing. He wouldn't have long to wait. Sure enough, 10 minutes later they came from both ends of the street. Paddy wagons and unmarked, no sirens. He saw Charlie 66 and some of the other night shift Ds, uniformed from Freo and stations beyond, skidding round the corner, driving up onto the lawn, taking out the letterbox, spilling out of the car. A dozen or more coppers pushing each other aside, the door cracking down, all dignity forgotten in the race to the spoils. A fist fight between 2 Ds from different stations spurred to some of the uniform. Lights went on as the neighbours woke up. Swan reversed around the corner. The kicked-in door and dramatics would give Stan a fright, and Swan would call him later in the day. Stan would be at home to take his call, no doubt about that. Coolbellup wasn't a good suburb to live in, lacking a front door. Then is now bad. Swan would call the developer and tell him he chased off the culprits, there's no way they'd be back. Then he would get paid. It wouldn't matter though if he wasn't. 20 of the state's finest bluing on a Kubi lawn was reward enough.
Thanks, David. This is set in 1979, or whatever. These things are set in the past. Are you gradually working your way up to the present?
Yeah, so Line of Sight was set in 1976, and I thought it was an interesting book to research because it involved, as an academic, most of my research usually involves hitting the books, but the research for Line of Sight involved almost entirely off-the-record conversations around people's kitchen tables and in parks and cafes and what have you. And I had originally intended Line of Sight to be just a one-off, but in the course of doing all of the interviews for the book, I discovered dozens and dozens and dozens of just terrific characters out there in Perth. People who I probably wouldn't get to meet in the ordinary course of my life. And I thought, it kind of saddened me that a lot of these jokers, these people, these characters, their stories weren't being told. And a lot of them were quite interesting. They had quite interesting things to say about the history of Perth, but not the kind of things you find in history books. So I thought I'd write a crime series, and I'm currently working on the third. So I moved it forward to 1979, which to me is a kind of an interesting year because it was the sesquicentenary of Perth. So there was all this kind of overt celebration, which many of you will remember. At the same time, it was quite an interesting time for organised crime in Perth because policing culture was still quite old school, as we'd see a few years later with the Nickelberg scandal and all that kind of thing. It was a time when it's fair to say that organised crime had already moved quite solidly away from the traditional economies of gaming and vice, under the containment policy, the number of brothels and call girls operating in the Perth area, and the illegal casinos in Northbridge, and the SP bookies around the place. And organised crime was moving into the much more lucrative area of drugs, basically. And there was so much money to be made there, and some people made so much money that some decided that they could take that money and become legitimate businessmen. And because it was a time when the stock market was still much less regulated than it is now, some of those legitimate businesses were involved in stock market scams. And I also remember it was kind of like the last heyday of the bank robber in Perth before security was beefed up. And as a child, I remember it seemed like every second day there'd be a bank robbery, and it was all kind of quite exciting and racy. And live music in Perth was quite strong, so I thought with this book I'd kind of tie all of those things together. Although I suppose essentially the germ for this story originated from a quote that my brother told me, and it was a quote by Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortes, and he kind of famously pillaged his way across Central in South America. But he said quite honestly, it's quite telling in its honesty. He said, "I and my men suffer from a disease of the heart that can only be cured by gold." I and my men suffer from a disease of the heart that can only be cured by gold. And because it came up in conversation because my brother and I were talking about how central gold is to Perth's story, the story of Perth as a city, back from the first gold rush in the late 1890s and henceforth. So I thought what I'd do is I'd take a couple of bent coppers and I'd take a couple of well, let's call them colourful Northbridge identities, and a couple of dodgy bookies as well, and there's the heyday of dodgy bookmaking as well in the late 70s. And I thought I'd throw them in, and a young kid, a young middle-class kid who's using bank robberies to fund his drug habit, but he's also using them now to set up a legitimate business as well. And I thought I'd take all these jokers and I'd stick them in a room, and they are part of a gold mining scam. The old pump and dump share market scam. I'm sure many of you have heard of it. Set up a very cheap company. You maybe hire a dodgy geologist to allegedly find some small samples of gold on an otherwise barren piece of land somewhere out in the middle of nowhere, and say that you're opening a company, and you get a couple of slightly shonky stockbrokers to spread the word. There's something really going on here, it's looking good. And then launch the stock at maybe 0.5%, and then invest a bit of your own money, and all of your mates get in early. The share price goes up and up and up, maybe to 4 or 5 cents, and then you sell and get out, and everyone loses their money, and then you close the company and move on to the next one. It's a pretty safe scam in those days, and I think a lot of people made a lot of money. A lot of people lost a lot of money. But so I put these guys in a room, and so they've decided to set up this kind of company. But lo and behold, the geologist turns up, and they had just expected him to do his job and sprinkle a few bits of gold dust around. But this geologist turns up and he says, "You know what? I've actually found we've hit the mother lode here." And I put these guys in a tricky situation because they're just about to do another pump and dump. But now they can dare to dream. They can become legitimate people. They can walk through Perth with their heads held high. They can be embraced by the wider business community because they're successful gold miners. And Frank Swan, as you can probably tell from the tone of that little passage I read, was a little bit bitter about his experiences having been booted out of the police force on mental health grounds. He's hired by the wife of the geologist, who the book begins with his suicide. And they can't really figure out why the geologist has committed suicide, because it clearly is a suicide, when he's just about to make a fairly large amount of money. So Swan throws himself in the deep end, like a good crime fiction character does, and the plot is generated from that. The conflict between the gold mining concern and Swan's own desire to get to the bottom of the geologist's suicide.
Do you think, David, the Cortez quote, which is an interesting one, is a kind of epigraph for all of crime fiction, or not?
Yeah, I guess so, particularly with crime fiction in Western Australia. There was an article that came out a few months ago in The Guardian about, and the gist of it was asking the question why some of the more interesting Australian crime fiction is currently coming out of Western Australia. And the tone of the article seemed a little bit incredulous and a little bit surprised, because Perth, after all, is no Gotham City. Let's face it, it isn't. So why was this, interesting crime fiction coming out of WA? And the writer of the article decided it had a lot to do with the gold boom. And myself and my crime writing colleagues from Perth kind of agreed with it, because it seems to me during a gold boom, because the stakes are higher, it creates what you might call a grand kind of crime opera, where all the usual human frailties that we all suffer from, greed, lust, desire, loyalty, disloyalty, deception, self-deception, all of those things are amplified because the stakes are higher. And the characters also seem larger than life, particularly if you're from over east, looking at some of our mining tycoons and what have you. So I think, yeah, crime fiction, as a rule, generally takes ordinary human behaviours, particularly our ordinary frailties, but because people are stuck in extreme situations, those things are magnified. And for me, personally, that's my interest in crime fiction, because I always like to use crime fiction as a vehicle to examine the stories we tell ourselves about our city, and I talk a little bit about that in the Perth book, but also the stories of the lies we tell ourselves. We all do it, and it's only when we find ourselves in extreme situations that the stories/lies we tell about ourselves are actually demonstrated. We all think of ourselves, no doubt, as brave people, as loyal people, as generous people, as kindly people, but often it's only when you're in an extreme situation that you actually find out the truth. You may not be as loyal in a situation where the consequences for being loyal are worse than they are for being disloyal. The consequences for being honest are worse than they are for being dishonest. And it's not until we find ourselves in those situations that we actually find out who we are. In crime fiction, because it does involve placing people in extreme situations, or violent situations, it seems like to me a good vehicle for exploring those kinds of things.
Underlying all crime fiction, I think, usually not made explicit, is the issue of morality. Cortez's comment sounds totally amoral. He does sound like, well, he sounds to me like a better conquistador than he would be a heart doctor. What do you think of the idea of the gold as the cure? And to what extent are you conscious of the kind of issue of ethics, morality in writing the novels?
Yeah, it's a curly one. I mean, I'm always guided by something English critic and author James Wood said. He said, in every case, writers need to avoid tying the moral shoelaces of their characters, and I think that's true. And French writer Stendhal also famously said that introducing any kind of overt ideology or any overt moralising into a story is the equivalent of letting off a gunshot at a classical music concert. It tends to draw attention to itself, and good fiction is about ambiguity in any case, isn't it? It's not about simplistic black and white. Although there is crime fiction, which is, you could say, it does kind of represent things like good and evil and morality in a fairly straightforward way. But I think you find most crime writers are interested in the shades of grey and in the ambiguity, and it's a great vehicle for doing that. I quite like the Cortez quote because it's just the honesty. The only cure was this strange metal found, alluvial or otherwise deep in the earth.
Yeah.
And but my characters in Zero at the Bone, they're not quite as honest as Cortez, which to me makes them more interesting. They know they want gold, but they want it for it's not the cure in itself. It's the cure for their fatigue, I suppose, with being perceived as underworld figures and shonky bookies. It's the cure for everything in a state like Western Australia. To be a successful gold miner is to become part of the in crowd, and securing the future of your children, the generations ahead, I guess.
And yet, for all that, it's probably not a cure for the heart, I imagine. Just to go back to the research, apart from conversations, do you go back? Do you use? I mean, the writing is very visual, I think, and I just wonder whether you use old photographs or archival film, or was it all these testimonies and your own childhood memories?
Yeah, I with line of sight, less so zero at the moment. I did go and look at old photographs in the Navy Library, but by and large, there's not a lot of fiction set in Perth during that period, and there aren't a lot of movies made or documentaries. So I really had to rely on first-hand stories, and I like nothing better. I mean, before I'm a writer, I'm a reader, of course, and aside from reading, I like nothing better than kind of sitting at the feet of some natural storyteller, whether or not it's just a natural, straightforward story, or it's a meandering kind of doddering old story that takes a long time to get from A to Z. I get a lot of kind of creative nutrition from hearing these stories, and I would ask. Let's say I'm talking to an ex-jockey. Jockey's a great people to interview, by the way, from the period. Let's say I'm talking to an old ex-jockey who's got grievances with people and has amazing stories to tell. I'll actually ask that person to paint me a picture. So this, when you were working at Ascot, what were your rooms like? Can you describe them for me? And sometimes, he might leap up and grab a photo album out of the drawer and that kind of thing. But I really do rely on people telling me their stories. I don't know how many people have seen Grand Budapest Hotel, the recent film. You know how it starts with the narrator, who's a writer, saying the idea of novelists being creative geniuses who just sit down and the ideas spring forth from their imagination is a bit of a myth, because actually, once you've reached a certain point in your career, people come to you with stories, and I've certainly found that to be the case. Not a week goes by, sometimes not a day goes by, without people contacting me through my website saying, "Hey, I've got a story for you." And then I might get work and I look at my watch and where do you live, mate? I'll be right over. So that does happen a lot.
That's good. Can you talk about the process of becoming a crime writer? You did work in teaching in prisons, I think, for a time. And was that before you wrote any of the crime novels, or is that what inspired you?
Yeah, it's line of sight. My first novel, which came out in 2006, was called The Summons, and it's not strictly a crime novel as you might ordinarily think of it. I would describe it as a social crime novel in the vein of Sicilian crime writer Leonardo Sciascia. I don't know if any of you have read some of his work, but he's a social crime writer, and he's not so much interested in whodunit kind of crime writing, but he's interested in the danger that ordinary people like you and I are placed in when we are witness to crimes. And being a Sicilian, I think he was the first Italian writer to mention the word mafia in the text. His first novel, The Day of the Hour, which I think came out in 1960-61, is a good example of that. It's about ordinary people, and it's about, I suppose, the damage that crime and fear do to the broader social fabric. So my first novel, The Summons, was set in Germany in 1933, and it's a very small, quiet, and domestic novel. It's about a man who is a World War I veteran who spent the intervening years in an asylum because he was traumatised by something that happened in the war, only to emerge in 1933 from the asylum to find that actually, now his country's gone mad, he can't cop a break. So it's all about him trying to find out where to fit in, and it's about the damage that, when your government has become criminal, how does an ordinary person negotiate their own kind of sense of personal morality. So it's a crime novel in the broadest sense. But line of sight, like I say, I soon realised during the research that it was going to be a crime novel. It just seemed to make sense. Although my first attempts to write it didn't necessarily work. It wasn't actually until I came up with the fictional character of Frank Swan that really kind of came alive. But originally I was focusing on the Shirley Finn character and her partner, because in real life Shirley Finn's character was helping me a little bit at that time. But it wasn't until I just said, you know what, this is a crime novel, and I'm going to write it as a crime novel, that it really started to kind of grow legs, I guess.
Mm. And the experience of working in prisons, did that sort of come into play very much or not?
Not necessarily. I mean, I taught in the West Australian prison system for about 3 years at Castlemaine and a little bit at Cannon Vale. So I suppose, you know, it was a very, very informal kind of class. I just turned up on a Thursday afternoon for a few hours. And it's about storytelling really, but we focused a lot on poetry and short story writing and a bit of script writing. And the fellows would share their stories. What it demonstrated to me, which is something I guess I just talked about, that interests me about crime fiction, is how ordinary these fellas are. You know, not really different to me and perhaps to you. Some of them have, apart from the odd career criminal, the majority have just made bad decisions once, and they were paying for it, you know, by being sent away. So I guess that kind of interested me, but I'd spent my late teens and early 20s travelling around the world, and there were times when I didn't have a lot of money, and in one or two countries I kind of made a living on the black market, so doing things that were a little bit on the shady side of things. So I got to know a lot of career criminals and hung out with them and befriended many, I guess. So I mean, I've always been interested in that kind of thing. And of course, crime fiction is a great vehicle to do that. It doesn't necessarily need to be crime fiction, but not specifically to do with Jesuit, because strangely enough, those kind of stories, because I was in a position of trust, I haven't actually taken any of those stories and used them in my own fiction. That to me just seems wrong, because if I was in a position where I could say, hey, you know that story you told me about when you robbed the bank and da da da, then that would be okay, which is something I always do with the people I talk to. I never go back and say, I'm thinking about using your story, is that okay? I didn't really do that. I didn't have the opportunity to do that with the guys in my class.
Did they help you with characterisation? I don't mean you just lifted one from prison onto the page, but whether you could meld a few different facets of different people and create characters within the book? There wasn't any specific characters, although I mean, it's just a very broad range of the male population that I would see, from the old to the quite young, and all the different behaviours kind of in between. A lot of the most aggressive guys were the young guys who weren't really sure where they fitted in the scheme of things, and the old stages were the most confident. And then you had a couple of businessmen. Alan Bond was in my class for a while, amongst other people. So it was a really quite broad range. And I guess there are a couple of guys I might have thought of as an archetypical kind of bank robber or what have you. But also, I meet a lot of those people in ordinary life. I mean, which is not to say that I live that kind of life, because I'm a suburban dad with a full-time job and all that, so I live actually a pretty quiet life. But in the course of my life, I've met many people. You meet them on St George's Terrace, I take it. I did say that the writing seemed to be very visual in the novel, and I wonder whether you're a sort of fan of watching. There's a lot of crime on television and in films. You were sort of avid viewer or not?
Yeah, to some extent, and that's been a great thing about crime TV or crime film over the last 2 decades. I think I use a very visual style because one of the great things about crime writing, paradoxically, is you're working within a certain set of parameters, because readers have expectations. And although in some respects I'm trying to explore the history of Perth or the untold history of Perth, my primary motivation is to entertain, and I always keep that in the forefront of my mind. But despite the fact that there are kind of common parameters, one of those common parameters is actually what makes regional crime fiction quite distinctive, and that is the importance of creating a sense of place. And because there hasn't been a long tradition of crime writing in Western Australia, it's very important to me to represent Perth in a way that almost makes the city of Perth a character in the story. I mean, that's what, to me, all good crime writing does, whether it's set in Scandinavia or New York or Melbourne, I like Peter Tack or someone like that, or Perth. So I mean, I quite deliberately use imagery that relates to Perth because I think it's important. Otherwise, a story set here might not be, why not set it in Queensland, or it really roots it in a sense of place. But,
within the crime genre, whether in novels or in television, let's say, there are actually different traditions. There's the genteel Miss Marple kind of English detective, who's a bit like the Sherlock Holmes, who works it all out, or Inspector Morse, things like that. There's the Philip Marlowe, tough guy, kind of stuff. Sasha is, whom you mentioned, the Sicilian writer, sort of philosophical crime writer, lots of ideas and philosophy in the work. So I wonder whether you're kind of interested in particular strands. This one is kind of he's sort of a kind of tough guy, I guess, but he's certainly not Philip Marlowe.
No, he knows he's. I mean, I deliberately wanted to make Swan. I mean, in some senses, he's a classic Raymond Chandler-esque character. Yeah. He said, "Down the mean streets a man must walk who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid." So he's that kind of guy. He's an ordinary person who finds himself in extreme situations. But in answer to your earlier question, one of the great things about TV for me are the American crime series, and some good Scandinavian ones as well.
Okay.
And I'm thinking of series like in the 90s, like Oz, set in the Oswald Penitentiary, and The Wire. I mean, one of my favourite American crime writers is a guy called Richard Price, and he writes, again, what you might call social crime. And he uses, and there are others like George Pelecanos and Mahane and others.
Yeah.
And they use crime as a vehicle to examine contemporary America. So just to give an example, Richard Price's most recent novel, Lush Life, which came out in 2007, 2008, I think. It's a terrific book. I mean, it starts with a pretty ordinary, everyday crime in a big American city. 3 or 4 white guys walking down the street. They're held up by a young African-American guy. One of the white guys stupidly refuses to hand over his watch. Gun goes off, he's killed. And from that kind of ordinary incident, he manages to spill out quite an exemplary examination of the state of race and class in contemporary America. And series like The Wire do that as well. I mean, I don't know how many people have watched The Wire, but it starts off on street level, and it's very deliberately done. It starts off on the street level with the street drug dealers, and then the next series, it looks at council politics and the way crime and drug money permeates political culture, and then it looks at the education system and the media, and it slowly kind of expands to take a bigger picture of a contemporary American city. And and there are other series that do roughly the same. The great thing about that series is those American TV series, they've been able to attract the best, the very best American crime writers to work on them. Because after all, it takes 30 hours or so to read an average novel, but what a delight for a writer to be paid to do it, but to be able to develop a character, such as Tony Soprano, or whatever, over 80 or 90 hours. It's just, I mean, you can really, as a writer, you can really throw yourself into it, and also say something interesting rather than having to abbreviate it down into a 90-minute film, which I think film now suffers in comparison to those kind of longer narratives.
You've heard this series. Oh, I've got one here. No, this is yours. just to keep you going. You mentioned the Scandinavians briefly, and it is extraordinary what a range of Scandinavian film and writing and is now in crime from the I mean, there's a good deal of politics in your politicians. So you get the political thrillers like Organ and The Bridge, through to the Joe Nisbet kind of Fargo, sort of over the top, black humour. I wonder, what you think of those strands.
Yeah, I haven't read a lot of Scandinavian crime fiction, principally because, an honest answer to your question, many of the ones I've started I just haven't enjoyed so much. I like the way they use darkness in a literal and figurative way. The cold and the.
They have a lot of it.
I wonder if it's just a matter of translation or whatever. But to me, the writing isn't as strong as some of the more vibrant American writers who really do quite interesting things, and and some British writers as well. But really, the kind of the genre of drama writing and kind of crime life, it's America is kind of up and it's undergoing a real kind of regeneration and resurgence over the last decade. Very kind of strong crime noir writing scene in the States at the moment, and more so in Australia, which I'm pleased to see.
Well, if we turn for a moment before I sort of get to the audience, you've written the book on Perth recently, at the same time, I believe, that you were writing crime fiction. So I wonder whether you might read a little bit from the Perth book, perhaps, and maybe might have a little bit of yarn about it too.
Okay, yeah, so it's a completely different book. For those of you who don't know anything about it, I was commissioned to write it based on the publisher having read the crime novel Line of Sight, and she enjoyed the way I used, or I represented her. I mean, even though I'm using crime fiction to explore some of the darker and more damaged parts of our city, I also hopefully use it as a means to represent my fondness, my genuine fondness for Perth as a place to live. So I was commissioned to write the Perth book, part of a series that they basically asked a novelist or writer in each city to write about the city they live in. So it's a writer's view of the city. The only brief, which was quite terrifying, being a novelist, was that it had to be 55,000 words. Apart from that, I could write anything I wanted. And of course, being a novelist, my first draft came in at about 100,000 words. And then it became a matter of just cutting. So, of course, the difficulty when you're writing about something as complex and organic and constantly evolving as a city, in 55,000 words is, you have to be very selective. So, I had the advantage of most of the other cities having already been written, so I could use those as kind of guides. I kind of did what the majority of the other writers did. I used what you might call a kind of an impressionistic approach, or discontinuous approach, using snatches of descriptions of Perth's history, some readings of some famous Perth artworks, the work of writers, sculptors, character sketches, politicians, but also ordinary people. I did go out and read every book I could find that had ever been set in Perth, watched every film, looked at every photograph and painting that I could find. And then I thought, you know what, I'm doing this all the wrong way around. I'm going back to speak to those old jokers that I've enjoyed speaking to so much. And really it was a shot in the arm. Yeah. And I also did something else most of the other writers had done. And I was kind of guided by something that West Australian writer and publisher Terry Ann White said when she started her book, Finding Theodore Brent. I think the opening lines are, we learn landscape through love, the physical spaces and our own thresholds of pleasure merge. So I thought, the only way I could merge or bring all of those disparate kind of things about Perth, moving backwards and forwards in time, was to use some personal accounts of my experiences of growing up in Perth and living in Perth. Some set in pubs, some down at the river, some at the beach. And this is one example. I've broken up the chapters using parts of the natural landscape. And this one's set in the river. And I had just moved down from Karratha, where I grew up for a long period as a boy. And I was really thrown off balance. I had a very mobile upbringing. I won't bore you with the details. But we moved 21 times before I was 10. Before my mum suddenly said, you know what, we're not moving anymore. And my dad just had to go along with it. And Perth happened to be that place. And it was so different from growing up in the Pilbara. We moved here in the middle of winter. And kids were different, and it took me a while to kind of come to grips with the place. And this little passage, it's quite lyrical. It's deliberately lyrical because it describes that moment where I suppose I first felt a sense or an inkling of love or fondness for the Perth landscape. I'm on. So the river was a haven for me. It was a place that reminded me of the one I'd left behind. where spiders and goannas and parrots and eagles had ruled the gullies, mud crabs and hermit crabs and mud skippers had populated the mangroves, the wild donkeys and kangaroos had filled the spaces now taken up by people. It was in the yellow sands and quarried limestone crags and bronze shallows that I felt most at home as a child newly arrived from the desert. Here my brother and I dug out cave cubbies from the banks of sand. We hunted rabbits with bows and arrows, we speared copper, and we paddled out on surfboards into the broader river. I can still remember the moment when I was suddenly happy to be in Perth, when I first felt like I belonged to my new home. It was nearly some morning on an incoming tide, and I was alone in the water. I must have been about 12 or 13. Walking along the muddy foreshore, I'd seen the imprints of flathead in perfect moulds at low tide, the fan shape of their side fins and the great weight of their spotted flanks, the broad arrow indentation of their cavernous mouths at rest. I'd become fascinated by this lurking predator, as I would later become fascinated by the kingi, or mulloway, the latest of sharks, finding as many books and speaking to as many fishermen and women as I could on the subject. I'd caught a few flathead on a line from jetties, but they were nowhere near the size I witnessed in lies left in the squelchy mud. Armed with a gidgee, I swam out into the current and drifted over the local sandbank at high tide, with its wave-rippled skin and sea lettuce tumbleweed, anticipating the flathead line of weight of the schoolfish who fed in the shallows. And they were, camouflaged against the speckled mud, watchful as my shadow drifted across them. I was able to remain immobile except for my shivering, and let the current carry me, relaxed and concentrating at the same time. The large brown Phylorhiza punctata and the smaller white Aurelia aurita, which is a fancy way to describe the white and the brown jellyfish, drifted with me and around me, my fellow travellers in the tidal current. In her novel Black Mirror, Gail Jones describes the jellyfish as fruit bowls pulsating above her, light caught semicircular in their fleshy domes. She half expected to see a baby face, whose jellyfish-like into view, while Robert Drew, in his novel The Drowner, describes them undulating below the surface as if swaying under glass. In their translucent but individually patterned globes, the urgent faces of unborn babies press up against the ceiling. These images of gestation would have appealed to me as a child, fascinated by the strange mobility of an unboned creature in an amniotic brine. The jellyfish were sometimes so numerous in the shadows that you could swim through them and upon them. The tactile nudge and little shiver of pleasure and revulsion as they brushed against my belly, face and legs. This was a time in my life when, to use author Brenda Walker's expression, I lived within a loose muscular happiness that my mind was going to have trouble catching up with, except that it did, and too soon, leaving me with only the memory of the small epiphany I had that morning floating in the river, the sunlight burning my naked back, illuminating the algae-rich shallows, the gobbleguts, blows and hardy-heads accustomed to my presence. As a giant flathead spurted away into the darkness, leaving a trail of smuts like a departing steam train, all of the sensual confusion of cold water and hot sun, levitation and submersion came together in a sudden recognition that I've never forgotten. The feeling of belonging to a place that did not belong to me, but only made an introverted kid feel more protective, even loving, of the river that carried me along on its soft skin. And yes, then I lead there onto a discussion of one of my favourite characters, Moondale Joe, who lived a fair bit of time around the river. So.
I suppose that writing, I mean, it's very lyrical, as you said, and in a way novelistic, and yet it seems incredible to me that, as you told me this morning, you were writing the first book at the same time you're writing Zero and the Bones. So I wonder if you could talk about that process, or it sounds schizophrenic, wasn't it?
2 words. Never again. Never again. But you know, I had the deadlines, and so I kind of had to. So I really, you know, in all honesty, I really enjoyed doing the research for the Perth book. But I found the writing of it quite grueling because the deadline was quite short.
Yeah.
And I really love writing crime fiction. Hopefully that enthusiasm comes through. So writing creative non-fiction, which is, I guess you could describe the genre that the Perth book is written in. I've never done a book-length work before, so I found that much harder to keep that kind of tone, maintain that poetic sensibility in the face of the stress of doing the two things together and working and my kids at home and all of the humdrum day-to-day stuff. But I treated writing Zero at the Bone as like taking a holiday. I could sit down and really throw myself into it. I was very comfortable with the characters. I really liked the main character, Frank Swan. And my wife doesn't know it, but he actually lives in the same house as us. He has 3 kids, I've got 3 kids. And yeah, it's pretty crowded in there. But they're spectral figures we do, occasionally I might raise a glass to them or what have you. It's a pretty small house. So I enjoy spending time with these characters. And then in the afternoon I would write the first book, which was much more serious business. Because it's not kind of fiction, so I have a responsibility to get it right, to the truth. It's a kind of contract, of course, you have with readers when you're writing non-fiction, to be as truthful as you possibly can. Whereas in writing crime fiction, in a sense, I suppose, I'm trying to be truthful as well, but I'm using fiction as a means to approximate some kind of truth. Much more fun, but yeah, I'm very glad I did the two, even if at times I was throwing things around.
Well, I must say the sense of grind you talked about just now doesn't show. Reading to the end of the book, it's lyrical at the end as it is halfway through and at the beginning. So that's quite an achievement. I wanted to throw it open in a moment to the audience, but I just wanted to ask you. You said that you edited the Perth book cut it almost in half. Do you go? I mean, the writing in the crime novels is very tight and sparse, and that's a kind of style I suppose you almost expect from crime fiction, unless you're Chacho or something. Yeah. So I wonder whether you had to go through a tough editing process as you did for the first book.
Yeah, I've got a very, very good editor at Penguin. Her name's Meredith Rose, and she's very tough, in a good way. So I will give Andy my first draft, and then she'll proceed to dismember it. And in conversation we've had some 6-hour phone conversations. The thing I love about her is she's just as obsessive as I am about getting it right. So we'll talk for hours about one paragraph and so on and so forth. So I've got a very good editor at Penguin, and I have very good editors with the Perth book. I mean, the crime novel is written in that kind of sparse way for a very deliberate reason. I mean, all of my crime fiction, although I have a main character, Frank Swan, I like to use what you might call a braided narrative because it allows me as a reader to kind of cross barriers of class and gender. So I might have one character from, who's quite well off, and another character who's basically a street level criminal. It seems to me you can get a more rounded picture of the city and its people doing that. What it also allows you to do in a technical sense is create greater suspense, hopefully. So you can finish a chapter leaving the reader hanging somewhat, and by introducing a chapter from another character's point of view, you're leaving that suspense kind of hanging. So there are technical reasons for doing that. Whereas the Perth book, I also had a fantastic editor with that, but that involved mainly rewriting. The odd passage wasn't up to scratch. I went back and rewrote it. But lots of cutting, but I actually quite like cutting. I find it quite therapeutic. With that beautiful paragraph.
Yeah.
The good thing about crime fiction is when you're cutting, you can always bring it back later.
Yeah. Courageous answer. Yeah, well, I thought you'd better have a drink before you get the difficult questions, which are ones the audience might ask. So, please, any questions of David from those of you who know or don't know how to rob a bank or bribe a politician? And I'll try to see from here. Please, yes. You might have to shout.
Okay, good question. I mean, I do have a producer out there at the moment trying to interest commercial television networks in the two
Right.
Frank Swan novels. It's difficult though because you probably noticed you've got the Franny Fisher stories, and you've got a couple of Peter Temple's novels made into film. But in any given year, there are dozens and dozens of Australian crime novels published, and I don't know, maybe one every 5 years will make it to the screen, maybe less, maybe one a decade. So it's very difficult. It's a very difficult kind of sell. I think mine are quite difficult because television and film also follows fashion, and 10 or 20 years ago, the idea of period crime was kind of in fashion, and now it's not. The producers, as I've been told, are looking for contemporary crime novels. So there's not much you can do about that as a writer. But it's a good question, and I think some of my peers, people like Alan Carter and Robert Schofield, they also write with a very cinematic style. It's great to. So you've got to be well cashed up people who want to throw your money into a foolhardy venture, and you may never see your money again, but you get the satisfaction of knowing that a local crime writer knows that money.
And Alan, of course, is a documentary filmmaker himself. So.
He could direct it.
Yeah. Well, money is probably the easy answer to the question, I suspect. Yes, please. The question is, could David talk about the journey from getting the idea for the novel through to getting it published?
So, the novels, or because like many writers, I wrote short fiction for a long time as well.
Maybe the first one, the first novel.
The first novel. I mean, I'll kind of answer both of this. So I had wrote short fiction for a long period of time because I was living overseas, and I didn't really consider myself a writer, and I was kind of self-taught. So I was lucky enough to send off short stories to Australian Short Stories. I don't know if anybody remembers that journal, run by Chris Pascoe and Lynn Harwood. Fantastic, and really gave a leg up to a lot of younger Australian writers, such as myself. It was really pretty sad to see it go. And Bruce is a great guy, and he became kind of a mentor to me. So I worked with him, and then I was lucky enough. Luck always has a lot to do with it. I was lucky enough to have a novel shortlisted for the Vogel Award, and so that I was able to kind of parlay that into at least a little bit of interest. And then I was lucky enough to have Dennis kind of a mentor a little bit when I was at UWA. So I decided at a certain point that it just wasn't working for me being I was working at a pub then. I was working teaching in prison, I was working in a pub, I was doing a number of different things. It just kind of wasn't working. What I needed to do was write full time. And the only way that I could find to do that was to do a postgraduate degree where you get a scholarship, which is what I did. I did my PhD at Murdoch and an MA at UWA. What the PhD allowed me to do was gave me money for 3.5 years, where I could just write. And I had a terrific supervisor there, Deborah Robertson, who also was very fierce, tough-minded, very good writer. And in between the opportunity to write full time and the advice I was getting, I was able to come up with a reasonably good manuscript. But again, it comes down to luck. I sent it off to an agent, and she liked it, and she took it straight to a publisher. But every writer's journey is different, and you like to say that every fantastic manuscript ever written finds a home.
Yeah.
Luck does play a part.
It is a tough journey. It's always a good question, I think. Yes, sure. Okay. The question is, how is e-publishing affecting David's writing, publishing now?
I think it's great. I mean, basically, more kind of people writing, the better. I mean, and I know some friends of mine who e-publish their novels, but they write a specific type of crime fiction, and they know their market, which is largely in the United States, where, like I said, there's a very strong kind of crime noir readership. There are some really good reasons to self-publish. But at the same time, there's some serious disadvantages as well. And as anybody who self-publishes will tell you, it's very hard to get your book reviewed. It's very hard to get your book in bookshops unless you physically go in and badger the bookshop owners. And it's very hard to get your book distributed. So you might have a fantastic manuscript and it might look great because you spent the money getting it produced nicely. But then getting it out in the wider world is not easy. In some cases it happens. It takes a lot of energy because you've got to be continually promoting your work. Yeah. And it works for some people and not for everyone. But I mean, more broadly, I think it's a good thing. I think there's 750,000 books on Amazon at the moment. So it's a very tough thing to do because how does one reader know which is a good manuscript, which is a bad manuscript, and trial and error. But some writers make a really good living at it, and it makes sense cutting out the middle person.
Yes, I was at the Australian Society of Authors Congress at the end of last year, and a couple of romance writers there talk about how they do it, and they spend, I would guess, at least 3/4 of their time marketing. And some of it you just think is kind of fraudulent or semi-fraudulent. They praise each other's books. They have a team of people who do song and dance and make up cards with quotes from the books that you can just download as used cards to send to your friends. Endless stuff, not just on Twitter and YouTube. So it's a whole activity in itself, which many of us are not very good at. Yes, please.
Frank Swan will make into
Funny you should say that.
The question is, will Frank Swan make it into the WA era?
Yes, he's there. The difficulty I'm having at the moment, I'm writing the third one, is I want to tell a story that captures something of the spirit of the times, for good and for bad, without being too obviously. Defamation, of course, applies as equally to fiction as to non-fiction. So I've got to be reasonably careful. But I think fiction, like I said before, can be a useful means to tell the truth about something, the people in the period, without actually being completely obvious. I think the American writer Flannery O'Connor described it well of her own work when she said that in her own work, the truth isn't distorted, but distortion is used to get at the truth. So I'll take some real stories told to me by some of my favourite storytellers, and I'll just make some up, which hopefully will give a picture of the spirit of the times, the kind of the craziness and the greed and the desperation and what have you. So it'll feel authentic to local readers. It'll feel like a proper representation of the people in the period, but will also be entertaining, of course, to people who are buying the book, over us, who know nothing about WA or could care less.
Yes, well, we're streamed online, so Brian Birchbold is probably watching right now. Yes, please.
Look, I want to say, David, first I read your book, and I really enjoyed it, so thanks very much. I liked the story, and I loved the way you captured time, and I've been here since '74. But I wonder how you stopped the book becoming a travel book. I.e., the story happens in Western Australia, and I couldn't imagine that it could happen anywhere else. But it's the balance between creating the place and writing the story. I wonder.
Now the question is, how does David get the balance between capturing that sense of place he talked about as being so important, and getting the story across, getting the narrative, so that the book doesn't become a kind of travelogue?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. It's something I think about because the reason I've been quite, I haven't made Perth background in the first two novels is for the reason I described earlier. There isn't a long tradition of crime writing, or indeed fiction writing, set in, these novels set in Perth. So I feel like I need to do a little bit of work there to create a sense of place, to represent Perth in a vivid way. The people who who live in Hobart or Auckland or the United States. And at the same time, I mean, the reason for doing that is because unlike if I was setting a crime novel in Melbourne or in New York or in LA, I'm not able to call upon a kind of a stock of associations that many people have with those places. So if I was writing a novel set in New York, I wouldn't need to do that because a large number of people on the planet already have a set of images that they associate with that particular city. So I don't need to do that work. That's where I felt like I have needed to do that work with Perth. But I'll taper that off over my coming fictional interviews, if you like. That answer your question? Sure.
Thank you. Any more? Yes, please, here.
Just have a little question. You call yourself a crime writer, which you are, but do you think you're a deviant writer? And by showing bits of deviance, you keep us all on the straight and narrow, and life's mores and norms. So, like you're a bit of a social policeman, really. We read you and think, oh, I can't do that. Or, do you think that comes into a bit?
I think people could hear that. I don't need to repeat it.
I hope not. Yeah, no, one of the things I can't stand is in fact, it's almost an oxymoron, didactic fiction. You know, to me, you can't have good fiction that is didactic. And those are the people I like least as well, even if I happen to agree with them. People who are moralistic as opposed to moral beings. They're moralistic. They like to point the finger and describe what is right and wrong. And hopefully with crime fiction, you're exploring, your characters are flawed and they may have strong opinions about what is right and not what is wrong. But they're not always going to make those decisions for better or worse, because that will make them predictable kind of characters. So I hope that's not how you read my work, because yeah, no, didacticism is and moralistic kind of preaching. It's the enemy of fiction. I almost don't think you can have fiction where you have that kind of overt teaching.
Yes, I think you read it as deviant and devious, not as moral.
I'll take deviant.
Any more? We have time for maybe one or two more. Or are you satisfied you've had enough crime for the night? Okay. We might stop then so David has a chance to sell some books, and he'll sign it out here. We have copies of both Zero at the Bone and the book Perth, which David read from. But before he gets his wrist working, please get your hands working, and thank you.